Hey, what's up, Unbroken Nation? Hope that you're doing well wherever you are in the world today. I'm very excited to be back with you with another episode with my guest, Dr. Caroline Leaf. Dr. Leaf, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. How are you, my friend?
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm doing really great and very excited to have a conversation. You were telling me a little bit about your backstory, and I've read about you, and it's an amazing, amazing story. So I'm excited to dive in and explore.
Well, and thank you. And a lot of this has been possible because of people like you, the understanding that I've now been able to gain in neuroscience, understanding the power of the brain, and really just kind of forcing myself into changing my life. And that's kind of the crux of this show is I want to be able to do that for other people. And so I'm going to come out just swinging and just go straight into this. I would love if you would start by defining neuroplasticity for us.
Well, that's a good place to start. So neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain, the ability of the mind to change the brain. So there's a very distinct difference here between mind and brain. And I deal with what we call scientific dualism, which we can dive into in a moment. So the mind is one thing, the brain and body are another thing. The mind, brain, and body interact together. And neuroplasticity is the ability that we have, the mind has to change the brain. So the brain is never the same because we're never the same from moment to moment. Every single moment we're experiencing something new, something different. And in that, as we experience something new, it's our mind that uses our brain, and therefore our brain changes. Now, neuroplasticity is one of those really interesting concepts because we're learning more and more about it. But I was very fortunate to be one of the first in my field to even research this field. In fact, I did some of the earliest research in the field of communication pathology on neuroplasticity because we were literally in the 80s told that the brain could not change. That was the going philosophy up until the mid 80s, that the brain could not change. And even the late 80s. And I remember sitting in one of my neuroscience neurology lectures, and one of my lecturers was telling us about, this unchanging brain. And if you've got a patient who's got a traumatic brain injury, or a chronic traumatic encephalopathy from sports injury, or dementia, or learning disabilities, or anything that where their brain had been damaged, well, you just got to teach your patients to compensate. So it was a very hopeless message. It was one of, well, you know what, they're just going to have to kind of downsize their thinking about how they can manage life. And I felt that was just not the right way, because I know we grow as humans. We all do. We instinctively know that we're improving and growing. Look at your own life story. So I remember putting up my hand and challenging this professor, and I mean, he was great. He said, okay, listen, that's a ridiculous question in my opinion, but please go and research. So I did. And that began a 38-year journey, which takes us to today, where I started researching this concept of, can the mind change the brain? And in fact, I did a TED talk on that. And I've done now 19, I'm busy with my 19th book. I've done multiple clinical trials. We've got 4 running currently. And what I do is I have spent my career clinically. I practiced as a clinical neuroscientist as well for 25 years, and I've been researching for 38 years. And what I initially did was work with people with traumatic brain injuries, learning disabilities, autism, dementias, all that kind of thing, and showed that with directed mind input, we can change the brain. And that's basically neuroplasticity, the fact that the brain is not fixed and it never stays fixed. And every time you get triggered from a past memory, that comes up and it basically changes. And even if we don't direct and control the change in the right direction, it still changes. And that's what we call the plastic paradox, that whether you like it or not, you are changing. And so is your brain and body, because when you change, which is your mind, your brain and body change. So my whole thesis and premise and research and theory and everything I've developed has been based on the fact that, well, if our mind is always changing in response to life, and this changes the brain and the body, and collectively how we show up is an interrelationship between the mind, brain, and body. Therefore, how do we manage this process? Do we have any power in changing what's happened to us and in changing how we go forward in life, et cetera, et cetera? And I mean, once again, your story is classic evidence of neuroplasticity in action being driven in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think the direction is so much of it, right? And I hear so frequently people say, well, this is just who I am, which
Mhm.
in my opinion is one of the most dangerous things we could
Oh, wow.
say. And that used to be what I would say. And what I'm curious about is as people are going through this, it dawned on me probably within the last year or so, like so much of what trauma is, it's not the abuse, it's not what happens, it's like the theft of identity. And what I've discovered healing and going through this process and now working with so many people around the world, it's like that's the thing we have to recapture. But I fear, Dr. Leaf, that people are just quote unquote stuck. And because of that stuckness, they can't seem to go into the doing. So for those people, like, where do you start when you're in this place? You're like, I'm stuck. This is my identity. This is who I am.
Now, I'm really glad you started there, Michael, because it's a very relevant point. And what I believe a lot of the stuckness has come from is not understanding how to rewire the brain and understanding things like what is the mind, what's doing the work. When we talk about getting through our stuff, what does that actually look like? Who's doing the getting through the stuff? Which part of us is doing that? And that's when you start understanding those kind of concepts, it then gives you the power to get unstuck. You get empowered to change. So I've shown with my research, when you start understanding the power of the mind, and you know what, let me cancel that statement because it's overused. When you start understanding what it means to be alive, what it means to think and feel and choose, when you understand that, and when you understand how you can drive that you can actually control the messiness of your life, and that it's okay to be messy, but we just need to learn to manage that. That's when you become very empowered. And I showed with my research that you can actually get things like depression, anxiety, which can be so incapacitating, and which aren't illnesses. They're warning signals, but they are warning signals that can incapacitate us. But you can get those under control by a factor of 81, up to 81%, which is phenomenal, without drugs, without any kind of fancy tricks, just pure mind management. And that's what I have worked in for all these years. So yes, we get stuck without the understanding. So it begins with understanding what the mind is, what the brain is, which I gave a brief explanation in the beginning. And then it goes into how do we manage this process? How do we deconstruct and reconstruct? And what do we do? So here's a little model of a brain. And most people think the mind and the brain are the same thing. People will talk about them, and it's totally understandable because that's the languaging for the last 40 years. The languaging has been very much around the brain and the mind and the brain, but as though they're the same thing. We also get so many messages through the media that the brain is producing the mind, or the thoughts come from the brain. And that's not totally accurate, because if you're dead, nothing happens with your brain. It just disintegrates. So there's a huge difference between you and I having this conversation and the viewers and listeners and someone who's dead, because we are able to actually listen to each other and think and feel and choose, which are the three actions of the mind. Mind thinks, feels, and choose. Think, feel, choose, think, feel, choose. It's an ongoing 400 operations per second cycling that helps you to actually process and experience like this discussion, like everything you have in life, and process that, puts it into the brain. So the mind's very active. The mind is you. It's your ability to think, feel, and choose. And we have this ability to interact with life. We take that through thinking, feeling, and choosing. That's kind of the currency. We put that into the brain as a structural change. And that then changes, sends a message to the body. And that's why it's stored in the body. And we can talk a bit about that with PTSD and complex PTSD and so on. And then that combination of mind, brain, body then produces you. So it produces what you say, what you do, how you show up. So if we take that process and we look at, okay, how am I showing up? I'm showing up stuck. I'm showing up stuck. I'm doing the same things, the same patterns, the same things over and over. So now we need to realize, okay, well, let me look at that pattern objectively. Let me stand back and observe myself and give myself grace, and first say to myself, it's okay to be a mess. It's okay to be stuck. That's okay. That's how you're showing up. That's not who you are. That's not your identity, even though it may feel like your identity, even though you may feel like you've been stuck for years and years in the same thing, that you want to say things like, this is who I am. It's not actually who you are. It's who you are at the moment because of. There's a massive because of behind that. Your childhood trauma was a massive because of that, produced your initial part of your life, which then, you got to a point where you shifted and changed. And, you felt you were reacting to life, because when we have things happen to us, we wire that into our brain and we try and cope. And sometimes it's just so terribly painful, like you experienced, that we wire toxic coping mechanisms into our brain. So when an experience is wired into the brain in a toxic way, it looks like this wiry tree. All the proteins are misfolded and everything's all weird and wrong, versus a healthy experience. This discussion is a healthy thought that you're growing. This would be a toxic thought. And this impacts how you function. And it's a coping mechanism. This experience is in the roots. Like anything starts with a root and then grows. This then grows into how you see yourself, then this collectively is how you're showing up. And whatever this is, whatever the story is, which in your case was all that trauma you experienced as a child, showed up, and it wouldn't have just been one, it would have been multiple of these showing up every day in your emotions, your behaviors, what you say, do your body sensations, because memory builds in the brain and the body, and also your perspective on life. And those are signals that then impact your interaction with others, your relationships, what you do, etc., etc., etc. And when it's so painful, those signals are coping mechanisms that aren't always the most valuable. And especially when the more painful it is, the more we try and suppress. So medications, drugs, sex, whatever, alcohol, you name it, anything just to numb the pain. But then eventually you hit a point where you realize it's not working because this is still there. The driving force is still there. And what's very interesting, Michael, in terms of this whole process is that 90 up to 95% of how you show up every day is based upon what has been built into your non-conscious mind by your mind. And your non-conscious mind, NON, is the non-conscious, NON, not unconscious. That's when you're sleeping and knocked out. Non-conscious is a very, very active part of mind, your biggest part of your mind, and it drives how you function. So basically, everything about every experience you've ever had has 95% of that, if not more, has wired in through your non-conscious, through your mind, into your non-conscious mind, and that's driving you. So 95% of how you show up every day is being driven by stuff that you weren't even consciously aware of building inside of you. Only between 1% and 5% of how you show up is consciously, where you've consciously focused on something, like choosing to stick on Facebook for hours or TikTok for hours or read so much negative news or whatever the case may be. So if we think about that, that means that a lot of how we are showing up through the signals are attached to an experience or found in the root. These are impacting how we function. So we have to, and what we have as an ability as humans is to tune in to our signals in order to find what the signals are attached to, in order to destabilize the neural networks, take the energy and power and emotional sting out of these by tracking down to the cause. You don't try and find out why. Like to try and find out why, for example, a child is sexually abused, or why what happened to you happened and the people in your life that hurt you. You're never going to understand because they're coming from their own trauma, and you're going to get very stuck trying to understand why someone did something. But you do want to understand, okay, the reason I'm battling with a relationship, or the reason I'm in the state of just constantly feeling like I'm panicking, or I can't sleep, I can't function, however it's showing up in your life, the patterns. There's a reason. It's because of what you've gone through. And therefore, I have to stay to a point where I'm comfortable with the uncomfortable, where I recognize, okay, this is what happened. This is my story. And I need to honor that, but I don't need it to control me. It happened on this 95% level. There was obviously a level of conscious awareness of that when it was happening, and then but you didn't consciously choose to have those experiences, but you were conscious of what it was doing to you. But we don't always realize that the non-conscious impact of how these filter into how we show up in life. So if we can start training ourselves, and it's never too late to self-regulate through looking at our signals to track to this thought, starting with the top part, which is our interpretation of ourselves and our identity, our value systems, how we think and feel and choose and see ourselves in relationships and the rest of it, where that comes from. In that systematic process of going from the signal to the thought and working down your way down the tree, you then are systematically weakening the neural wiring in your brain. You're weakening the structural changes in every cell of your body, and you are weakening the gravitational fields in the mind, because the memory is also in the mind. So it's in 3 places. So this systematic work over time weakens all those fields, and it doesn't take your story away, because what happened to you, it never goes away. But notice how I'm moving it down, and I don't have my small tree here, but I'm going to do to the point where you can hardly see it. As I work over time in the systematic way, I rebuild a new healthy version. So I can't change what's happened to me, but I can change what's in me. And that is mind management, which involves the self-regulatory process, which we can develop. It's in us. It's part of our resilience, but we have to develop it. And it starts with us really giving ourselves permission. First of all, it's okay to be a mess. That's not who I am. It's okay to have negative. No emotion is an illness. No emotion is bad. Every emotion is telling us something. Let me embrace my signals in order to find the message, in order to reconstruct into something that I can handle. And that is process over time. So let me stop there, and then we can dive into a little bit into about the process. I'm sure you'd like to unpack something of what I've said.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, there's so many places that you can go in that because there's so much depth and scope about this process. And the thing that came to mind is I heard this word, you used it a couple of times. You said control. One of the things that I fear so many people have come through traumatic backgrounds like me is they go, I have no control over this, and my life is a disaster. This is how God made me, and I must suffer. And I argue, well, that's not actually necessarily true. But one of the things in the lack of control is we seek to find it. And unfortunately, especially in this society, we seek to find it through prescription medication. We seek to find it through things that are not actually to our betterment, to the vices, to the drugs, the sex, the alcohol, the things of that nature. Where does control of your own mind really play a role in this?
So this is also you asking amazingly good questions. The control is one of those words that when someone, and you can really relate to this, and anyone who's listening who's been in a dark place, and including, and we've all got our stories, when you're in the depths of despair, the last thing you feel like you have is control. And that's often where support from others comes in. But then there might be cases where you're in a situation which, Michael, I don't know your full story, but just knowing, working in years of trauma with people, sometimes there is no support. And so therefore you really are on your own. And you can't really see things. And at that moment you do feel complete. I mean, a child who's constantly being abused or going through the most horrific things, where's the control there? And so that then is a child that will go into adulthood with most likely the coping mechanisms to protect oneself, which is, maybe they had to learn to fight back, or as you say, numb the pain with anything that takes away that pain. And then enter us into our current society where people's stories are no longer really heard, except in a few environments like, the work I do, what you do, etc. You go into the traditional biomedical system, of which, I've been a part, but not in, I do it differently. Obviously, as we're practicing clinically, I'm coming from a different angle, but the traditional system is one of, okay, well, tell me your symptoms and let's find you a diagnosis and let's give you a treatment. That works beautifully for cancer and diabetes and, brain tumors and things like that. But when it comes to a complex childhood where there's been excessive trauma, just giving you a label and a medication is not going to fix the problem, because you have a whole bunch of these in your head that make you feel overwhelmed and out of control. So it is a slow process of educating and learning to dive deep introspectively into your wise mind. The wise mind, that inner knowing that got you out to where you are now, where you now are so in a state of wise mind, Michael, that you reach out and help others. And so that process of is a process of empowerment. And it's a cyclic thing that happens over time. And it can be multiple ways. Either someone comes in your life and actually starts helping you, or you reach that rock bottom point and you manage to actually help yourself and pull out of it. There's different ways that it will happen. But hopefully most people reach, and according to the research, oopsie, my little tree's falling over, 3/4 of people will actually reach the point that you have, where they've gone through complex trauma and will get through it with lingering effects. But those lingering effects do not have to be the effects that live with you for the rest of your life, because our current biomedical model messaging is, okay, well, you are depressed because of a broken brain. Your brain is damaged, and that's it for life. So therefore, you need medication to fix it. If you have diabetes, you need insulin. So type 1 diabetes. So you get insulin, it restores it, it heals the body. If you have a pathogen like a virus, like COVID virus, we now have antivirals that can start fighting it. So we can fight it like that. When you have a bunch of toxic experiences, it's as real as a COVID virus. COVID virus is made of protein. So is this experience. It becomes a protein tree-like structure in your brain. So your immune system is going to fight this just as much as it would fight the COVID virus. So this is very deep what I'm saying. And experiences from any stage of your life don't just they're not wishy-washy, go away things. They are physical, structural, protein, chemical changes inside of your brain that look like trees. This is a thought tree that has lots of roots and branches, which are memories. So memories of the experiences coalesce into a thought structure. So this is a collection of a lot of data of what happened, the source over there, and the processing and the interpretation, the different parts, what happened, how you've processed it and coped, and in the interpretation, and how that shows up in your signals. So this, when this is dominating, when we look at life through this, we do feel out of control. And the control comes back in as we realize this, and we get to that point, and it's different for everyone, and it's got different, as I mentioned. Sometimes it's a person that says something, or you read something, or people have said they've been on a train and they've seen a sign in a subway, or someone said something to them at a shop, or they just one day just had I don't know exactly what your revelation was, but there's something that shifts. And when you get that shift, instead of this, there's a little bit of this, and then you start climbing up. And what I've tried to do with my work is help people to do that climbing in a way that doesn't make them go backwards, and in a way of understanding. Because to rewire the networks, to take the power out of this and make it small and rebuild healthy new thoughts, where you still remember your story, but no longer does it control you. You are controlling your story, which is evidence in your life. That's not going to happen in one day or with a medication. The medication is not going to fix this. You don't have a brain disease. Obviously, your brain's affected. And I've done a ton of research, and in my latest book, I do explain this, and I have images, and I show my clinical trials in a very simple way, and I have a very simple way of explaining how to do all the stuff I'm telling you. But essentially, this is not the cause. The cause, this in your brain is not the cause. The cause is what happened to you. This is the manifestation. So the thing happens, the mind experiences the experience, and goes in the brain, and the brain and body show up in a messed up way. Obviously, everything you have, the mind needs to use the brain to experience it. So obviously your brain's affected, but it's not the cause. It is the response. So as we manage our causes, as we identify and deconstruct and reconstruct the causes, so we rewire the brain. Full circle back to one of your first questions, which was neuroplasticity. Because of the neuroplasticity of the brain, this work I'm telling you, where we focus from our signals to the thought, to the root, reconstruct, etc., daily, 15 to 25, 45 minutes a day over time, and I'll tell you the time in a moment, that is rewiring the brain. Neuroplasticity for trauma which is the main focus of your podcast, and for anything, building habits, breaking habits, etc., works in cycles of 63 days, not 21, not 1, not 5 minutes. The medications, like the psychotropic drugs, they're not even medications, they're actually drugs. And they're drugs that numb your pain or numb the feelings, but they're not fixing anything. They're making structural changes in the brain that may make you feel better and may help you cope for a time, but they're not going to solve the problem. They may ease it for a time so that you can face and start dealing with issues. But you need to know the side effects, and sometimes the side effects create more problems than what you actually need. Now you've got more problems, brain damage problems on top of the original issues. So, when it comes to psychotropics, it's really important that you fully understand what you're getting into, and that you ask your doctors for the document that they should be giving you of exactly what these are, how they work, their addictive properties, because they're all addictive, and how to withdrawal effects, and to understand that when as you are going through a process of facing stuff, it is painful, and numbing that's not going to help you. You've got to go through the pain. Called the treatment effect. You're going to get worse before you get better. I've had some patients that start this process, and there's actually one of the stories in my book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, of one of the patients in my clinical trial, who at day 1, no identity, totally depressed, etc. Long story short, by day 21, they were saying things like, I'm not depressed anymore. Day 1, I'm depressed. That was the identity. Life's falling apart, everything you can imagine going wrong. Doing this work daily for 15 to 45 minutes, and we can talk about in a minute what it is. By day 21, they were saying things to us when we brought them back into the clinic to do the evaluations and so on, the brain, blood, narrative, everything. They were saying, I'm not depression. I am depressed because of. That's a massive growth. Then they also said this, but I feel more depressed and more anxious, and I'm having panic attacks, and I'm grieving, but it's different. I'm actually feeling human emotions, and those are valid emotions, because they're starting to see what the pain was from. They had suppressed childhood trauma. In this particular case, this person had gone through terrible childhood trauma and had managed to suppress it for all these years and kind of function, but was falling apart. And because these are volcanic, eventually they will explode in your life. Eventually these things will explode. You can suppress for a certain amount of time, but they will eventually explode. And that's what had happened in this person's life. And so they started shifting, but by learning to get control back slowly in these cycles, they started seeing increased depression and grieving as an element of control, because they said, okay, I know I'm depressed because I can see that what I went through. So therefore I should be feeling depressed. That's a very normal human response to those terrible things that I went through in childhood or whatever, and grieving the lost time. And I mean, I'm sure you can relate to this, Michael. So that's growth. But in this society, the minute you feel those, oh, you're sicker, there's a disease coming back. You don't have a disease. You're trying to process life experiences. And it will get worse before it gets better, but then it does start changing. And this is why it's so important that you work for the beyond 21 days. Everyone says 21 days. It's not 21 days. 21 days does a major shift. You'll bring things up and you'll start seeing the changes, and you'll start building a new way of thinking, etc., etc. But if you don't push on for another 42 days, that new little thought is way too small to override this one. You need the extra energy taken from this and put in so that this becomes nice and big and strong. And I'm going to put two next to each other so that you can see it becomes nice and strong. Only when the new thought is nice and strong, which takes another 42 days, totaling 63, are you then going to remember your story, but you're not going to be functioning from your story. You're going to be functioning from the new way of thinking. And that process brings control.
I love that. And I love everything that you just said. And there is some truth to this idea that you do have to suffer your way into health. And when I hit my rock bottom at 25 years old, I was 350 pounds, smoking 2 packs a day, drinking myself to sleep. And, I put a gun in my mouth. I was done. And it's amazing. 11, almost 12 years later, here I am having this conversation with you because I made a declaration to myself. I said, what are you willing to do to have the life that you want to have? And the answer ultimately became no excuses, just results. And what that meant to me in that moment was I'm going to show up every single day, do the hard things, suffer, unfortunately, in through the healing, and be able to do that thing in becoming the hero of my own story. Dr. Leif, I want to push people to go and investigate your research and your books. I have read them all. It's been a huge transformative process in my life just to consume your information. For the sake of time, and I want to respect your time, I know we can't go into depth, but can you tell everyone where they can find you before I ask you my last question?
Absolutely. Well, drleaf.com is my website. My social media handles, including TikTok, are Dr. Caroline Leaf. So I'm on TikTok as well. So all the normal platforms, Instagram, etc. I have a podcast called Cleaning Up a Mental Mess, where I teach you a lot of stuff. And then my latest book is this one, Cleaning Up a Mental Mess. And the app that I have is called Neurocycle, which pretty much takes all these systems that I've developed, which you do daily over these cycles of time, to help heal and rewire the brain. That's all been put into my app, which we're constantly adding and updating. And that's available on iTunes and Google Play. I think that's a good start. So
It is. And of course, we'll put all the links in the show. And I have consumed all of this information. I can promise you it's been transformative for me. My last question for you, my friend. What does it mean to you to be unbroken?
I love that question. For me, it's learning to recognize and accept that it's okay to be a mess. It's such a human thing that we have this messy part of our mind that's operating all day long because of our free will. And that's how we experience life and be mess. But in the messiness, accepting the messiness and giving myself permission to be messy, I can then repair and grow. And for me, that's what unbroken means. It's being accepting, giving myself the permission to be a mess and not seeing depression and anxiety or frustration or anything that I do that's stupid or whatever as, oh, that's the end of it. That's who I am. It's just, how I'm showing up. And this is how I can manage it. So mind management, along with accepting the mess and then managing the mess, is absolutely, I do this. I do my stuff all the time. I mean, I love this. The concept is called neurocycling, the 5 steps that are the system that I do every single day. And I'm always in a 63-day cycle. And then I use it all day long because day-to-day struggles. You can do the big stuff where you work on the big work all day long. And then you're facing stuff all day long. Things happen all day long. So I use the neurocycling in a quick version. And I teach you how to do that in the book and the app all day long. And that has helped me, Michael, to be unbroken. I really practice what I preach.
I love it. Thank you so much for being here, my friend. Unbroken Nation, thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, comment, share, tell a friend. And until next time, my friends, be unbroken. I'll see you.